Hello everybody, my name is Laura Dell'Agostino and I am a postdoc research fellow at Politecnico di Milano in Italy. Impact is the name of the research group where I work together with my co-authors, and our group deals with the socioeconomic impact of infrastructure, strategic investment, and public policies. Thanks to Data for Policy, I'm going to present you a study about precision policies and local content targets in research-rich developing countries, focused on the oil and gas sector in Mozambique. The submission number is 116. I will focus on the motivation behind this research and on our empirical findings. Please refer to the discussion paper uploaded on the Data for Policy community on Zenodo for all methodological details. A first set of questions I would like to answer is the following. What does it mean, precision policy? What are local content targets? Why are we interested in these topics? And why are data relevant to address these issues? First of all, precision policies emerged thanks to the big data revolution that made available a large amounts of detailed and timely data. And these policies use data to set up measures that take into account the characteristic of specific groups of users in order to optimize the use of public resources. Focusing on the energy sector, these policies are a reality in developed countries, but not in developing countries, which suffer from the lack of good quality data. We are especially interested in local content policies that are policies at the intersection between energy, industrialization, and economic diversification, aimed at optimize the exploitation of energy resources in order to support long-term growth. The case of Mozambique is particularly relevant since this country has recently gained a significant place in the global energy value chain due to large offshore projects that led local content policy on top of the policy-maker agenda. How can we describe local content policy? Well, first of all, we define local content as the contribution of a multinational company to the local development through the purchase of local inputs and the employment of local labor force. Therefore, research-rich developing countries adopt local content policy to promote the activation of productive linkages between the extractive sector and the whole economy, and establish targets in terms of the minimum share of local inputs of goods, services, and workforce that international oil company must or are wanted to satisfy in their projects. To avoid unambitious targets which do not maximize the effect on the economy, or on the contrary, unattainable targets due to a lack of available skills in the local suppliers that can discourage potential investors, policymakers should set local content targets consistent with the existing local capabilities. Therefore, the identification of the most appropriate data for the assessment of local supply capability and the definition of local content target is crucial for the design of effective policies. At present, available datasets differ according to their unit of analysis. Sector-level datasets are the traditional dataset for local content assessment and use input-output table to inform about the amount and type of intermediate inputs needed in the production of one unit of output in a given sector. However, this approach has been increasingly questioned due to the low level of sectoral disaggregation of input-output tables that generally include oil and gas within the broad mining and quarrying sector, together with other extractive activities that use different technologies and inputs, with different potential for local content. In few countries, project-level datasets are compiled based on past oil and gas projects. One example is Brazil. But of course, this approach is not realistic in countries that have no experience in the oil and gas industry, such as Mozambique. Starting from this framework, we explore whether and to what extent detailed firm-level data can support the design of local content policies, with special reference to the definition of local content targets of oil and gas projects in research-rich developing countries. In particular, we exploit a publicly available dataset developed by the World Bank Enterprises Survey Unit and use the case of Mozambique to demonstrate the informative potential of firm-level data for policymaking. We compare the local content estimate obtained using firm-level data with those obtained using input-output tables. In this way, we offer two main original contributions. First, we demonstrate that firm-level data provide a more accurate representation of the capability of the domestic supply chain to provide inputs to the oil and gas industry compared with input-output tables. Second, we show that the enterprise survey for Mozambique could represent a reference model for data collection to be extended to other research-rich developing countries to support local content target definition. Specifically, in terms of local content target, we estimate both gross and net local content. We call gross local content the share of goods and services provided by first-tier domestic supplier against international oil companies' total supply. That share reflects the actual impact only if domestic suppliers do not use imported inputs. Since this hypothesis is unrealistic, we estimate the net local content as the difference between gross local content and import of first-tier suppliers. Of course, we could increase the level of precision and completeness considering the domestic purchase at the different level of the supply chain, but it requires a larger set of data than those at present available. For Mozambique, we can rely on two data sources. The first one is the EORA database that provides input-output table for many years and many developing countries. The input-output table for Mozambique has 25 sectoral breakdown at two-digit level of the International Standard Industrial Classification. The second source are the Mozambique Enterprise Surveys. The standard survey covers 601 firms in manufacture and service sector, and the special survey focused on 49 firms from extractive sector. Both questionnaires include some country-specific questions that are well suited to estimate the share of local content. First, the firms are required to declare the share of inputs of domestic origin used in production, which represent the share of inputs purchased from domestic suppliers over total inputs, and therefore is a good proxy of their gross local content. Second, local firms have to state if they are suppliers of goods and services to companies in the extractive sector. At the end, our sample is composed of 645 firms representing 17 sectors, and we have 135 suppliers of the extractive sector. Moving to the methodologies, I will briefly describe the equation we use, but please refer to this discussion paper uploaded on Zenodo for details. The methodology is pretty simple for the gross local content estimation. Using input-output table, the gross local content is computed as the ratio between domestic purchases of intermediate goods and services of a given sector and the total purchases of intermediates of the same sector, which include also imported inputs. Using firm-level dataset, we use the information about the average share of domestic inputs used in production provided by firms answering to the first question just mentioned. The methodology is a little more complex for the net local content estimation, since we have to know the sectors of activities of the first-tier suppliers. And therefore, we must refer to a given project. Specifically, given the gross local content of a project, we have to know the project structure, the share of domestic purchases of the international company for each activity sector, and the share of imports of each activity sector. For this last data, some working hypotheses are needed. And I really invite you to download the discussion paper to go into the details. Since due to time constraint, I prefer you to show the results. And specifically in this table, you can see the gross local content obtained for all sectors using input-output tables and enterprise survey dataset, considering the full sample, including all firms interviewed by the World Bank, the extractive sectors suppliers subset, which covers only companies that provide inputs to the extractive industry, and the other firms subset, with all firms not included in the extractive sector supplier subset. Our results confirms that input-output table overestimate gross local content in most sectors compared with firm-level data. This is evident in transport equipment, and in wholesale and retail trade. In other cases, the two figures are more aligned, such as for the mining quarry sector. We can also see that focusing on the extractive sector suppliers, gross local content is lower than in the full sample, suggesting that extractive firms require a higher share of imported inputs compared with the sectoral average. This result is in line with the literature, which highlights that most of the Mozambican firms are not able to meet the high international standard required for being part of the extractive industry supply chain. Focusing on mining and quarrying, it is evident how a similar gross local content at sectoral level hides a high heterogeneity among subsectors, from a maximum value of about 98% in the extraction of salt to a minimum of 10% in the extraction of oil and gas. This table makes clear that input-output table overestimate gross local content in oil and gas, and might lead policymakers to set local content targets which are far from the real potential of the domestic market. What about net local content? Well, the comparison of the result reported in the two tables clearly highlight that input-output table data determine an overestimation of the net local content as for the gross local content. Finally, we exploit all the publicly available information about a real oil and gas project in Mozambique, that is the Rovuma LNG project, to estimate its net local content, considering that the total gross local content of the project is about 9%, at that the largest share of equipment and machinery will be important. So we exclude these sectors from gross local content composition. Comparing the results using the sectoral gross local content from both input-output table and enterprise survey, we observe that local content falls from a gross level of 9% to a net level in the range between 6.9% using input-output table and 6.6% with enterprise survey data. These results provide evidence of the actual potential of the local supply base when considering the quantity of imports from first-tier suppliers, and might be taken as a reference by policymakers for the definition of realistic local content targets, well aligned with the development level of the country's industrial supply capacity. To conclude, we demonstrate that the gross local content in the extraction of oil and gas is significantly different compared with the other extractive subsectors. We confirm that in a developing country, the extractive sector suppliers have a lower gross local content than other firms. And as a consequence, input-output table data led to a significant overestimation of gross local content. This result is also reflected in the net local content, which consider the import effect along the supply chain. Therefore, firm-level data can support the policymaker in the local content target definition within a precision policy perspective. And specifically, the World Bank Special Survey for Mozambique could be a reference model for data collection to be extended to other research-rich developing countries to support their local content policy definition and the design of data-driven policies. Thank you very much for your attention. Comments and suggestions are very welcome, both by email or during the conference.